Periods, for example, in Earth's history when we had 3 times as much CO2 as we have today, or periods when we had 10 times as much CO2 as we have today. And if CO2 has a large effect on climate, then you should see it in the temperature reconstruction.
Love milk. How could I do this to myself? I lied to her, and plus I lied to myself. Nothing's left, the relationship that lost its breath. It stopped breathing, it died last season.
If we look at climate through the geological time frame, we would never suspect CO2 as a major climate driver.
None of the major climate changes in the last 1,000 years can be explained by CO2.
We can't say that CO2 will drive climate. It certainly never did in the past.
I've often heard it said that there is a consensus of thousands of scientists on the global warming issue and that humans are causing a catastrophic change to the climate system. Well, I am one scientist, and there are many that simply think that is not true.
Man-made global warming is no ordinary scientific theory.
This morning, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made up of...
It is presented in the media as having the stamp of authority of an impressive international organization.
From the IPCC, the
United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Claim that the IPCC is the world's top 1,500 or 2,500 scientists. You look at the bibliographies of the people and it's simply not true. There are quite a number of non-scientists.
And to build the number up to 2,500, they have to start taking reviewers and government people and so on, anyone who ever came close to them. And none of them are asked to agree. Many of them disagree.
Those people who are specialists but don't agree with the polemic and resign, and there have been a number that I know of, they are simply put on the author list and become part of this 2,500 of the world's top scientists.
People have decided you have to convince other people that since no scientist disagrees, you shouldn't disagree either. But that, whenever you hear that in science, that's pure propaganda.
I don't even like to call it the environmental movement anymore because really it is a political activist movement, and they have become hugely influential at a global level.
It is the story of the distortion of a whole area of science.
Climate scientists need there to be a problem in order to get funding.
We have a vested interest in creating panic because then money will flow to climate science.
There's one thing you shouldn't say, and that is, this might not be a problem.
If we look back further in time, before the Little Ice Age, we find a balmy golden era, when temperatures were higher than they are today, a time known to climatologists as the medieval warm period. Since the mid-19th century, the Earth's temperature has risen by just over ½ a degree Celsius. But this warming began long before cars and planes were even invented. What's more, most of the rise in temperature occurred before 1940, during a period when industrial production was relatively insignificant. After the Second World War, during the post-war economic boom, temperatures, in theory, should have shot up. But they didn't. They fell. Not for 1 or 2 years, but for 4 decades. In fact, paradoxically, it wasn't until the world economic recession in the 1970s that they stopped falling.
What we found consistently is that in a great part of the planet, that the bulk of the atmosphere is not warming as much as we see at the surface in this region. And that's a real head scratcher for us because the theory is pretty straightforward. And the theory says that if the surface warms, the upper atmosphere should warm rapidly. The rise in temperature of that part of the atmosphere is not very dramatic at all, and really does not match the theory that climate models are expressing at this point.
50,000 years, here's what the temperature has been on our Earth. Now, one thing that kind of jumps out at you is, do they ever fit together? Most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. The relationship is actually very complicated, but there is one relationship that is far more powerful than all the others, and it is this. When there is more carbon dioxide, the temperature gets warmer.
Al Gore says the relationship between temperature and CO2 is complicated, but he doesn't say what those complications are. In fact, there was something very important in the ice core data that he failed to mention. Professor Ian Clark is a leading Arctic paleoclimatologist who looks back into the Earth's temperature record tens of millions of years.
When we look at climate on long scales, we're looking for geological material that actually records climate. If we're to take an ice sample, for example, we use isotopes to reconstruct temperature, but the atmosphere that's imprisoned in that ice, we liberate, and then we look at the CO2 content.
Professor Clark and others have indeed discovered, as Al Gore says, a link between carbon dioxide and temperature. But what Al Gore doesn't say is that the link is the wrong way round.
So here we're looking at the ice core record from Vostok, and in the red we see temperature going up from early time to later time at a very key interval when we came out of a glaciation. And we see the temperature going up, and then we see the CO2 coming up. CO2 lags behind that increase. It's got an 800-year lag, so temperature is leading CO2 by 800 years.
There have now been several major ice core surveys. Every one of them shows the same.
Carbon dioxide is not the cause of that warming. In fact, we can say that the warming produced the increase in carbon dioxide.
CO2 clearly cannot be causing temperature changes. It's a product of temperature. It's following temperature changes.
The ice core record goes to the very heart of the problem we have here. They said, if the CO2 increases in the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas, then the temperature will go up. But the ice core record shows exactly the opposite. So the fundamental assumption, the most fundamental assumption of the whole theory of climate change due to humans is shown to be wrong.
To understand this, we must first restate the obvious point that carbon dioxide is a natural gas produced by all living things.
Few things annoy me more than to hear people talking about carbon dioxide as being a pollutant. You're made of carbon dioxide. I'm made of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is how living things grow.
What's more, humans are not the main source of carbon dioxide.
Humans produce a small fraction in the single digits percentage-wise of the CO2 that is produced in the atmosphere.
Volcanoes produce more CO2 each year than all the factories and cars and planes and other sources of man-made carbon dioxide put together. More still comes from animals and bacteria, which produce about 150 gigatons of CO2 each year, compared to a mere 6.5 gigatons from humans. An even larger source of CO2 is dying vegetation, from falling leaves, for example, in the autumn. But the biggest source of CO2 by far is the oceans.
What amazed me as a lifelong journalist is how the most elementary principles of journalism seem to have been abandoned on this subject.
In fact, the theory of man-made global warming has spawned an entirely new branch of journalism.
You've got a whole new generation of reporters, environmental journalists. Now, if you're an environmental journalist, and if the global warming story goes in the trash can, so does your job. It really is that crude. And the reporting has to get more and more hysterical because there are still, fortunately, a few hardened news editors around who will say, you know, this is what you were saying 5 years ago. Ah, but now it's much, much worse. You know, there's going to be 10 feet of sea level rise by next Tuesday or something. They have to keep on getting shriller and shriller and shriller.
It is now common in the media to lay the blame for every storm or hurricane on global warming. But is there any scientific basis for this?
This is purely propaganda. Every textbook in meteorology is telling you the main source of weather disturbances is the temperature difference between the tropics and the pole. And we're told in a warmer world, this difference will get less. Now that would tell you you'll have less storminess, you'll have less variability. But for some reason that isn't considered catastrophic. So you're told the opposite.
Love milk, how could I do this to myself? I lied to her, and plus I lied to myself. Nothing's left, the relationship that lost its breath. Stop breathing, it died last season.